Welcome to Identity Architects, the podcast that's dedicated to spotlighting individuals who are changing the way that data is used to improve customer experiences. I'm your host, Ben Cicchetti, and for this episode, I had the opportunity to sit down and chat with InfoSum's founder and CTO, Nick Halstead. Before we jump into that conversation, a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button wherever you enjoy podcasts to know when the next episode lands. But without any further delay, let's jump into my chat with Nick. Hey Nick, welcome to Identity Architects.
Hi Ben.
How's everything going?
Good, it's been a nice quiet morning to start off with.
Nice. Well, we'll keep you busy for the next little while. For anyone who's unfamiliar with you, can you just give us a quick introduction to Nick Halstead, who you are and what you do here at InfoSum?
Sure. So I'm Nick Halstead, founder and CTO, and built the company for the last 6 years. I've been a programmer since age 9, and I, like any founder, get involved in every part of the business. I notionally cover all of the technology, but everything I enjoy is helping to drive the vision out of the company and how we use the best technology to take advantage of all the technology we've built for the last 6 years.
Awesome. And you mentioned obviously that you founded InfoSum kind of a little over 6 years ago now, and I've been fortunate to join that journey for about 4 years of that. But where did the kind of inspiration idea of InfoSum come from originally?
So it really goes back to my last company, DataSift. I spent 12 years building that. That was very much a company all around taking social media data, finding the value within that, processing thousands of data streams. And I got very close to a number of the biggest social media companies, therefore Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and I recognized a number of key things around the unfair advantage they have in marketing services. Predominantly the large ones like Facebook and Google have direct access to 3-4 billion people around the world, and from a data perspective they have a centralized access of understanding of those people. And coming out of DataSift, I really was thinking about what would level the playing field for everyone else, not just around marketing, but to think about how do you solve for data, making every company be as data rich as Facebook and Google. And that's really about, even if you're the largest, some of the other largest public companies out there, you may still have access to a couple of 100 million people, but these days it's a global economy, and people want to be able to market to literally everyone, like you can on Facebook. And I was thinking about the technology that would break down those barriers of those big companies to be able to work with each other. And my vision really was, if you could take the top 100 next biggest companies who really do have good specialist access and knowledge of customers in whole kinds of different areas, in sport, in fashion, in gaming, but they only have slithers of access to those users. And it came to me of, what technology could I build that would allow those companies to be able to work together, and thinking about the challenges that I'd seen in the last 12 years that were stopping those companies working together. And fundamentally, I've always had these 4 pillars that I had in my head before I started even, touching a keyboard, which was trust, privacy, identity, and integration. And that's the order of priority I saw that were the challenges. And so it was trust, because fundamentally you don't get 100 companies working with each other because ignoring privacy and all of the other kind of challenges. But before that, each of those companies would not give up the commercial value of the knowledge of their users to another company without some kind of balance of payment of why you to do that, which is why collaboration between companies is so difficult, because you've got to work out what that balance is. And so solving trust is the idea. It's not that big companies don't trust each other. It's more that it's the leakage of value to the other company. And so the trust part was, well, how can these 2 or 20, it doesn't really matter how many companies, work together without them having to worry about the leakage of value, and the trust aspect of it is because if we can suddenly go, right, we can work together, but I don't have to think about the fact that my knowledge of my 100 million users is suddenly going to be leaked to the other company. I can have a much better discussion about, well, what would be the upsides of us coming together. Second, clearly privacy. I'm sure we'll talk about it later on, but clearly if you are going to start using your customers' data, the last 6 years has been transformational in the world of privacy. When I started this, I kind of got the view, because of going back to my story of Facebook, I spent 3 years inside Facebook building technology for them, and realized that when you get to kind of Facebook scale, there's clearly a huge amount of focus on them for the things that they've previously done wrong. I actually believe back when we were working with them that they were certainly doing their best, but it made me, when I started 6 years ago, way ahead of when people were thinking about GDPR, certainly years ahead of CCPA, that privacy was starting to become at the forefront of consumers' mind, and it was trickling down into companies, certainly into governments, and therefore turning into law, and what changes we'd need to make. Third, and identity and integration, we can again cover later on, but at the heart of most of the world's biggest companies, to bring people together, you need to obviously understand who they are, and therefore we would need technology to do that. And again, going back to building DataSift, the previous company, much of what I did there was around identity, and everything was to do with identity. So I carried a lot of that experience into InfoSum. And finally, every company I've ever met has always internally and externally had challenges around, when you bring more than one data set together, the integration challenges of that. So it was thinking about, how could I create a whole new way of thinking about solving for that as well.
Awesome. That makes a ton of sense. And, obviously what we're talking about really there is data collaboration as a concept, and obviously something that we empower. And what the approach we take has clearly required people to almost reimagine what data collaboration means and how data collaboration could be enabled. So the question we obviously get asked the most is how our technology works, the kind of the non-movement of data element of what we do. And there's probably no one more qualified to answer that question than yourself. So how would you describe what InfoSum is and how our technology works?
Yeah, and it's interesting because there are obviously new companies out there starting to come into this space. Fundamentally, what I was trying to solve for was actually taking, at the heart of it, actually quite a simple approach. But generally in technology, the simpler the solution, the more complex it is to actually implement. I.e., if you're going to make it really easy for the customer, then you want to hide all of the complexity, and then actually makes it more complicated. So we actually had a really, really simple answer to solving for trust, and that was what we call the non-movement of data. So genuinely saying, if you're going to work with another party, we will not at any point move your data to the other customer. And because I looked at a whole range of different technologies at the time, 6 years ago, that were either emerging through research in the open source community or other kind of larger companies that had looked at this space, and none of them really solved for what I fundamentally wanted, which was beyond being able to say, oh, I can encrypt something or I can obscure something. That to me wasn't enough. All of those, many of the techniques, in the end, we always find with things like encryption and that they're reversible. So that wasn't enough for me. I wanted a solution that meant it could never actually be broken. And the simple idea that I came back to, which was this, what the industry kind of starting to recognize now as what they call the privacy safe intersection, which is to say, if I can fundamentally agree between two parties that we know the same people in a way that is safe, the rest of the technology can then be built on top of that. And so InfoSum really is made of like 6 or 7 distinct layers, but at the heart of it, we have the base layer, which is using what we define broadly as a mathematical model. We have a number of patents on these, and we're obviously sensitive around the unique way that we develop this. But the simple way to think about this is we use a mathematical model to take a set of people and be able to match them, but not by sending the list of the people. We send a model representation of the identities of those people. That could be any form. It could be email addresses, it can be names and addresses. It doesn't really matter, because they're turned into a form that really no longer represents the underlying data, and it's not a reversible form. But the importance is that the model that we send can only be tested, and this is again pretty standard known thing in data science. For a bit, like I always use the analogy of how DeepMind suddenly revolutionized using AI. Not that those techniques hadn't been around for 20, 30 years, but computational power and access to data suddenly became available. And what entered my mind was that we suddenly had the computational power to use a very old technique where you need to do what in computer terms is called a reverse lookup, which is, instead of me sending a list of people, which clearly breaks the concept of non-movement and it breaks the idea of privacy, is that if I can send a model that is representing my list of people, but is not, again, technical term, can't be enumerated, you cannot list the data back, I can send that model to the second party, and the second party has to test their data. And we have lots of diagrams in our literature which try to represent this, but it's literally as simple as I have to one by one go through, the second party has to go through my list of names and check whether those people exist in the other party's data. Now, what's beautiful and so simple about this is, if I don't have the originating name or email or address, I can't test for it. All I can do is go, well, if I've got some data, I can see whether that person is in the other data set. And all that does is confirm that, let's say Nick Halstead is in one data set, and then the other data set says, is Nick Halstead in there? We can basically go, yes, Nick's in there. But it's both very technically challenging to do that at scale and at speed. And that's literally what we've spent the last 6 years doing, is doing that. And what you end up with is an agreement between the two parties. Even if one party has 100 million people in it and the other has only 2 million, you get an agreement suddenly between the two, but neither party gets to find out anything about, in that instance, let's say there's 1 million overlapping, there's no way of either party learning about any of the other people that they know. You basically, that's why it's we call it a privacy safe intersection. You're being able to just agree on who you both know between that. Now, why that's so fundamentally important is, in the world of data privacy and trust, you are not having to commingle the data at any one point. I'm not having to make the other party in GDPR parlance the data controller. I'm not sending the data to them. I'm just literally being able to agree that we both know that we agree and know the same party. Now that is at the heart of what we do. And when I see other companies talking about decentralization and that they're privacy safe and they're using hashing or they're using a range of different techniques out there around federated learning or multi-part compute, the question I always immediately ask is, well, how have you agreed on who is the same person across those two data sets? Because if you don't know that Nick Halstead is Nick Halstead in the other data set, you're going to have to bring those two data sets together somewhere. And if you're then going to have to go through a separate process for your ID matching, then all of your concepts around decentralization and around the way that you're doing the processing of the data are flawed. You can't call yourself a clean room or any of these other, or privacy safe, because you have clearly had to run a separate ID matching process that involved handing the data over to it. And so that is utterly unique to InfoSum, that we combine the clean rooming, the identity matching, and the data processing all through the lens of non-movement. And if you don't have non-movement of the actual identity, then whatever other techniques you're using, you are not genuinely decentralized. That is so unique to us that we can keep the data separated.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen obviously a lot of success at the moment in the media and advertising industry, where there's this kind of burning bridge that we we solve for, which is the loss of third-party cookies and consumer trust and other elements. But really, the InfoSum technology has applications across tons of industries, right? Any industry where the customer experience can be benefited from two or more data sets being analyzed as one, there's a use case for InfoSum there. But are there any industries you're particularly interested and excited by at the moment?
I mean, if you had asked me 2 years ago, we focused on marketing services first because it's an industry that is certainly in distress, and it's one that I knew very well, and a lot of the early team were focused on that area, but it could easily have been health data, insurance, finance, etc. What has always excited me the most is that within every business there is huge amounts of untapped first party data within the business that isn't joined up. So irrelevant whether we're going into media use case, that media use case around activation or measurement is actually just a stepping stone for most businesses to actually improve their actual internal understanding. And so I get excited by the idea that as more of our bunkers, that we call them, the technology that we install with our customers, they get to start thinking about, and it's a horribly, often massively overused term, but this whole idea of the 360 degree of the customer really doesn't exist out there at the moment. But it's something that excites me just across industries, that you can suddenly bring together 5 different departments across a company. I've talked to numbers of banks over the last number of years, and it always amazed me that things like their credit card business was a list of customers completely isolated from their knowledge of their current account customers, that they didn't have the ability to deal with bringing and unifying those two data sets together. But I also I'm not giving away anything from this, because this is a thought I had years and years ago, which was that wouldn't it be amazing in any country, not just the UK, obviously that I know the best, is why any health service in most countries couldn't be joined to the world of apps. A good example of that from a health perspective is you take something like Strava or you take Fitbit and be able to join that to health records and be able to understand what the impact of someone suddenly getting fit is on what their general health over the course of a couple of years. And that's been a massive struggle in that industry, that people are clearly very sensitive about their data, and InfoSum's probably the only company in the world that genuinely can do this research across data sets without needing to suddenly open up lots and lots of legal frameworks to be able to have all that data moved around and centralized, etc. So there's just so many exciting ideas around data co-ops in different industries and different ways to leverage data that, as again, going back right at the beginning of the conversation, of trust has been so much of a fundamental blocker to companies actually doing genuinely interesting things with their first party data, because rightfully, like any company, would be disastrous if you suddenly leak, both from a these days privacy outlook that data is going outside of your four walls, but it's also lowering the value of your business if you let it out. So the idea of collaboration with non-movement is just a game changer to any industry.
Yeah, completely agree. And obviously one of those industries that I think we're both excited about, being gamers that we are, is the gaming industry, who are producing just huge volumes of data. More and more gaming is happening online or on digital platforms. And you actually got your start in gaming, is that right?
Yeah, at the age, never went to university, left school at 18, went, thankfully, a number of pupils that were a year above me actually went straight to a number of companies. One of them immediately rang me up when I left school and offered me a job in the games industry, and I went from 5-6 years of programming, writing lots and lots of games, to running some of the biggest studios in the UK, running big, teams of 600 odd engineers, building some of the biggest titles out there, and that just gave me a great understanding of how to build companies around engineering. But then it's been great to see, for coming back to InfoSum, that some of our strongest clients in the gaming sector, I mean, I can't remember years back that the kind of gaming world suddenly became worth more than the movie industry, and clearly it continues to grow. And they've because the gaming industry has obviously always been good at technology, they've adopted the idea of the logged in user way ahead of probably the rest of any of the media industry. So unlike many of the publishers who are struggling with understanding who their customers are, the games industry of everyone knows them the best. So that, and clearly they are, like everyone, super sensitive about where their data goes. And so we have great clients in that industry, and it's an exciting world where we are out there building a whole new network of companies with very much a clear privacy goal and the desire to use that data, but use it in a sensitive way. But it's still a very untapped world, where there's around the world, who doesn't play games in some form or other, and that generally is great first party data.
For sure. And obviously you touched on their kind of the identity crisis that publishers are facing, driven largely by the loss of the third party cookie and the cookieless future that we face. And there are a bunch of solutions coming to market that are looking to either replace the cookie or offer some kind of alternative. Where do you think we'll end up? Will we have that kind of Lord of the Rings, one identity to rule them all, or will we end up in a different place?
Yeah, and it's mildly disappointing that things are being pushed back on that, because it's very easy for people to become complacent that the consumer hasn't changed their mind about why they've so unhappy around the marketing industry and the way people are being tracked. I think the final outcome, there certainly won't be one identity. The fundamental of the whole idea of a universal ID is pretty abhorrent to me, in that you couldn't have any more of a more Orwellian idea than idea that everyone is assigned one ID. And that's when people say universal ID to me, it's like I'm amazed more newspapers don't write articles of saying, right, most countries always have these kind of arguments around why they don't want centralized ID cards from a privacy point of view, but it's essentially what is putting out there. So I don't think that'll happen. European regulations certainly won't allow it to happen. And so, that will be still a very fragmented industry. But I think what people need to understand is it's not per se the ID that is the challenge. And in fact, cookies get a bad rap, in that, the cookies in browsers were never designed to do everything they do. But it's the implementation of how they're used that is wrong, because there's no protection within browsers of how they therefore get abused. But having an ID, a central ID rather than a cookie, doesn't solve the problem of transfer of knowledge. i.e., in the end, the thing that InfoSum and our customers are most sensitive about is that there should really only ever be two parties involved in knowing anything about the customer. It should be the advertiser, who may already know you and wants to target you and has already got permission from you, and the publisher, who knows you because you're on their site of whatever form that be it TV, web, mobile. But clearly you're on their site, you accept their terms and conditions, that if it's a site that is powered by advertising, you accept that. Those are the only two, in our view, the only two parties should need to know who you are and be able to continue to collect data on you. What the challenge with cookies is the transfer of knowledge around the ecosystem to allow the machinery to target you, means that 100 companies get a copy of your data, and that's really what everyone is trying to achieve. Is we still want to be able to have the mechanisms to be able to measure and target and analyze, but it's who gets to see the underlying data. And that's where we have been successful in InfoSum going into that industry, is saying we can still do all of those things, but we can make sure that the parties in between who have no rights to collect that data do not do so. So my view is, though it will be fragmented, but I hope over time technologies like ours, we won't be the only one clearly, mean that the consumer can be more more confident that their data is not going to end up being spammed everywhere.
Yeah, and you mentioned obviously the consumer and the fact that the awareness among consumers is higher than ever around how their data is used and how their data is collected. What do you think? And obviously that means businesses are more aware of that and therefore taking steps to correct any risks for themselves. What's the best way to address the kind of data security and privacy issues, and who's responsible for then communicating that to and educating the consumer?
Well, it's hard. Clearly, if you're a smaller player, it's hard to make a dent, but what's fantastic from my view when I talk to the world's biggest, Fortune 500s, is they recognize that the risks they run of getting this wrong now, both from a regulatory point of view, but also the consumer view. You know, Apple is famously, has taken a pretty strong line through their the phones and being able to obfuscate who you are and be able to clearly define whether you are happy for certain apps to access data. But they've also gone on the offensive, and they have definitely taken the responsibility to actually put advertising out there, and you can be cynical about it or whatever, that it's self-serving, but it's certainly raised resonated with, I think, with the consumer, this idea that I think the last Apple one was just lots of people walking around the room following you for everything you do, and that's the reality of what was and continues to go on. So I think it is the responsibility of the biggest companies to be more opaque about what technology they are using to protect their consumers' underlying data. The world where you can just stick lots of lawyers on it, paper over it, make it look like you're meeting the letter of the legal requirements of the things like GDPR, but the suddenly we're at the line where, are you actually meeting the ethical interpretation of what those things are meant to do? Because there's always loopholes and whatever around these things. So what I see is companies being much more sensitive to, well, are we actually really approaching this in the right way, rather than just the legals.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. I think consumer awareness is only going to go up, and consumers ultimately will hold companies accountable, and kind of if companies don't take action, they will potentially force companies to take action by where they spend their money.
Yeah.
So if we move on to a few quick fire questions, just to kind of wrap things up with you, Nick, what is your earliest memory of technology?
Actually, even before I got my first, I'm old enough, unfortunately, to remember, certainly in the UK, the first kind of consumer mass market computer was the Sinclair ZX81. Unfortunately, we just recently lost Sir Clive Sinclair, who started it all, which is, was very poignant for me. But before that, I actually had a uncle that was a whiz with electronics, and he actually had a number of my earliest memory of being excited by tech was a valve-based calculator that was like the size of a typewriter, that you could do quite complex things with it. But it was that was to me something that was like that sparked my real interest, and it's never stopped since then.
And then what was your kind of first job in technology?
Well, it actually goes before school. So I actually first started out working in Welling Garden City at a computer club, where I knew pretty much more than the people that actually worked in the computer shop that it was based in. And so they started paying me, and then I actually then went on to a number of other. I was submitting computer games in back in the day when you typed in your before tapes and discs and all the rest of it. Lots of magazines used to publish code that you'd type into your ZX81 or BBC Micro, and I used to write that and submit them into magazines and make money from them.
Oh, wow. And knowing what you know now, what would you say to yourself when you were first starting out in your career?
I'd have probably started myself earlier. I was probably, I think I always count myself as a not a genuine entrepreneur, in that a Richard Branson, who at the very heart of his being is always to make new companies. It took me I was very comfortable working for other companies until a few things in my life then made me rethink what I should do. But there's I always say to people that there's, if you've got friends and family, there is no risk in today's society of going and doing it yourself. So I wish I'd started earlier.
Awesome. And what do you love about what you do right now in the industry we're in?
There's a lot of things I hate about it. that it needs to grow up. I love the creativity that it shows, but it's somewhat misguided at times. I love the fact that what we're achieving, that what comes out of it, but I want it to grow up to be more of an enterprise business. But I always, the reason I do it is in the end is down to the technology. I love high scalability, high speed, frequency, and complexity. That's what always drives me, is what is the programming challenge within it.
Yeah. And we've touched on throughout this conversation identity a lot, the concept of identity. How would you explain the term identity to a 10-year-old?
Not easy. In the end, it comes down to, how do you know someone? What's the piece of knowledge that identifies one person? We will have hundreds of, maybe not hundreds, but a lot of pieces of information, and an identity can be made up of not just your name or your home address. It can be almost demographic bits of information, because any combinations of bits of knowledge help uniquely identify someone. So it's all the knowledge, all the things that are about you that create some level of uniqueness to help identify you from someone else.
And what keeps you awake at night, Nick?
Nothing.
Okay. Well, what gets you up in the morning?
Really building the company. For all my love of the technology, it really does come down to that a company is made up of staff. I get asked a lot about how I've consistently built businesses over the last 20 plus years. And it's really just focusing on talent and hiring myself. I've been very lucky to have a lot of amazing mentors myself. And the thing I've always been taught is hiring myself out of every job and surrounding myself with people that are way smarter than me. So getting up is just the fact that I get to talk to amazing people every day.
I love that. That's awesome. Is there anything we haven't discussed or that we haven't mentioned that you think we should?
Can't think of anything.
I'll take that as being a fantastic host then. And
yes,
we covered everything.
I think you've covered everything. It's been yeah, exactly.
Awesome. So obviously the concept of identity architects is for us to speak to people who are pioneering the way that data is used to improve the customer experience ultimately. So when you look at the team here at InfoSum and the team that you kind of discussed building up around you, who do you think I should sit down with next to chat to?
Obviously, we're only just starting this, and obviously the person I've first brought in to replace my main job, which was I was CEO before, was Brian. So I think getting Brian to give his perspective would be great as well.
Yeah, completely agree. We'll get right on that, and hopefully we'll line Brian up for a future episode. This was awesome, Nick. Thank you so much for spending the time talking to us. This was a fascinating look at kind of you, InfoSum, and the industry as it exists today and in the future.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Ben.
Thank you again to Nick for joining us for the latest episode of Identity Architects. It was fascinating to discuss the world of data collaboration and identity and take a deep dive into what we do at InfoSum to enable data collaboration that powers better customer experiences and prioritizes the privacy of consumers. Remember to hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to podcasts to know when the next episode lands. But until then, thanks for listening.